Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our monthly FCI seminar series. We will give everyone a few minutes. People are still logging in. We're really excited today. We're having Dr. David Lee present on behalf of our Cancer Epidemiology and Surveillance Program. Dr. Lee, feel free. You can throw up your slides whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. I will do that. Oops, I need permission. Hopefully someone can grant it. There we go.
There you go.
All right, can we see everyone see that?
Looks good.
Okay.
All right, so welcome everybody. We are back for our monthly FCI seminar series. So we're so happy to see you guys all here. Today we have Dr. David Lee, who is our lead PI for our Cancer Epi and Surveillance Program within the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. Dr. Lee is also the professor and chair of the Department of Public Health Sciences here at University of Miami. He is a chronic disease and occupational epidemiologist and has been continuously funded as a PI or co-PI on various grants from the NIH and the CDC and prevention since 1993. He serves as the principal investigator for the Florida Cancer Data System, which is the second largest state cancer registry in the United States. And his research interests include public health applications of mind-body practices for the prevention, management of stress and living with chronic disease, enhancing the health of the U.S. workforce, cancer surveillance and prevention, and sensory impairment surveillance. So today he is going to be presenting some work that our team at FCI has been doing on workplace tobacco policy and cancer risk in Florida firefighters. So without further ado, I will pass along to Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soleil. So good afternoon, everyone, and we'll be talking today about looking at potential impact of a specific firefighter-specific workplace tobacco policy and trends in cancer risk in Florida firefighters. Oops. So tobacco use currently accounts for nearly 20% of all cancers in the United States. And when you look at some of the other modifiable risk factors, the next three are basically equivalent to just the risk for tobacco use alone in the United States. So if we could somehow wave a magic wand and make one of these risk factors go away, we would definitely eliminate tobacco use from the United States and from the world, for that matter, and we would see a marked reduction in cancer over time. So our U.S. Surgeon General has issued a series of reports over the years, and we now have a clear linkage between the increased risk of 18 different types of cancer linked to smoking tobacco products, primarily cigarettes, but also cigars as well. And as you can see here, that this spreads across different systems within the body. Urogenital cancers, including kidney and bladder, a variety of head and neck cancers, a variety of digestive system cancers, of course, lung, and then also one hematopoietic cancer, acute myeloid leukemia. All of these have been shown to be causally related to use of tobacco smoking in the worldwide, but particularly in the United States. So basically, there's no safe level of exposure to tobacco smoke, and this includes secondhand smoke as well. And we won't be focusing on this in today's presentation, but smokeless tobacco, there is an increased risk for oral cancers, esophageal, and pancreatic cancers as well. But in tobacco use is much more deadly in its smoked form, as we can see on this, the slide here. So when we take a look at the components of cigarette smoke, we have over 7,000 different chemical compounds, and over 70 of which are confirmed to have carcinogenic activity. This includes nitrosamines, benzene, aromatic amines, polyaromatics, and other types of carcinogens, all present in every single cigarette that is ever lit and consumed by people, and then also secondhand smoke as well. We'll see this similar sorts of chemical profiles. And of course, as we know, firefighters on fire scenes are exposed to many of the same chemicals and carcinogens that we find in tobacco smoke itself. So it's a double hit for anyone who has a career in firefighting, who's also a smoker, because they're getting these constant exposures through tobacco smoke, and then they go fight a fire and are further exposed to other carcinogens. So tobacco control efforts have really driven down the number of cancer deaths in the United States. And this is a very, very powerful graphic that takes us back more than 100 years, showing a clear pattern, a clear temporal pattern between the rise in tobacco consumption in the population and the increase in lung cancer, in this case among men. So it was really the invention of the cigarette rolling machines that automated the process, that made sort of the mass distribution of tobacco through cigarettes possible at the turn of the last century. And we can see that the average per capita number of cigarettes sold per adult per day in the United States climbed steadily in the early part of the last century, with some variations that had something to do with the economics, like the Great Depression, for example. But we really didn't have any data on the health effects of smoking in these early years. And it wasn't until the 1940s and 1950s when epidemiologists started to conduct research suggesting that that smoking was harmful to a person's health. And the field of chronic disease epidemiology actually emerged in part as a result of this challenge to figure out whether or not smoking tobacco in fact was related to different health outcomes. So they literally had to develop new tools, statistical and methodological tools, to be able to look at these associations, because they just did not exist in the earlier part of the last century. So these studies started coming out first in the UK and then in the United States. And there was an accumulation of scientific evidence through the 1950s. And then in the mid-1960s, the US Surgeon General put out its first report linking smoking to deaths from cancer and heart disease. And that publicity surrounding that actually started to drive down consumption, per capita consumption, that continues to go down to this day. Further, other strategies, tobacco control strategies, included things like taxing cigarettes here in 1983. We had the first Surgeon General's report on the health effects of secondhand smoke in 1986, and then followed by ultimately a ban on smoking on airplanes. I'm old enough to remember when you used to be able to light up and they had smoking sections and non-smoking sections on planes, which is just absolutely ridiculous because of the circulation path. You're basically in an aluminum can at high altitude, breathing recirculated air. And so the concept of no smoking section was kind of ludicrous. The availability of nicotine replacement therapy came in the mid 1990s. And then finally we started to see restrictions in smoking in indoor settings, with California banning smoking in restaurants in 1998. And then in 2009, there was also a major, more than doubling of the federal excise tax on each cigarette pack of cigarettes sold in the U.S. So it's this was again the per capita. Here in the red here are the lung cancer mortality rates per 100,000 in men, and I really want to point out how parallel these slopes are. So you can see a very similar pattern, the rise of per capita cigarette consumption, peaking here and then falling, and then a rise in the lung cancer mortality rate that peaks around 1990. And that was a big turning point. And we started to see reductions in lung cancer deaths from that point forward. But I want to note that these slopes look largely parallel to one another on both sides, going up and then going down. So the distance here between these two lines is about the same. And this is reflective of what we refer to as a latency effect between the exposure, the risk factor, in this case, tobacco smoke, and then the emergence of an adverse health outcome, in this case, lung cancer mortality. And so this latency period here, this difference in time, is essentially measured in decades. It's roughly 2 decades where you will see this lag between as things increased in terms of consumption, there was a lag period, but then you start to see the rise of lung cancer, and then it peaks, and then it starts to decline. 20 years after, we start to see declines in per capita tobacco consumption. And so over here on the other side, if we're just looking at all tobacco-related deaths, cancer deaths, we can see here clearly that this was a demarcation right here. In 1990 is when we started to see declines in tobacco-related cancer deaths in men, and there was a delay here in the peak for women, and this again is driven by the fact that over time, smoking was in the first part of the century, or last century, was almost exclusively male dominated. But then the tobacco companies got the bright idea that they could market their products directly towards women. And those ad campaigns were very successful. And so we started to see women taking up smoking in larger numbers, largely in part because of the marketing acumen of the tobacco companies. And so there was a bit of a delay. And so the peak for women in terms of cancer deaths per 100,000 was 1985, and there's been gradual reductions. You can see the slope here is not as dramatic as the slope here for men, but there's still, even as we moved into 2015, there's still much higher rates of mortality, tobacco-related cancer mortality in men versus women. And so let's keep this latency in mind, because it's going to impact some of the data that I'm going to show you specifically now for firefighters. So want to switch gears now and just talk about briefly some of the work that we have already presented to this group, but for the benefit of those that weren't present there, we had undertaken a linkage of our cancer registry in the state of Florida. And as was mentioned, I'm the director of the cancer registry. And we obtained firefighter certification records from the state fire marshal's office that gave us critical information as to, like, the year at which a firefighter was certified to work in the state of Florida. You have to have that certification in order to work as a firefighter in Florida. And we got that information along with critical other identifying information, like, of course, the name of the firefighter, a year of certification, their gender, their date of birth, and importantly, their social security number. And these identifiers are really important for us to be able to link to our cancer registry to identify a proper match between a firefighter and then a subsequent record in our database that indicated that that firefighter was diagnosed with a particular cancer, say lung cancer. And those identifiers like social security number go a long way to avoiding, like, false matches and that sort of thing. So we had a very, very robust linkage. We think it was a really highly accurate linkage. And we then compared the cancer incidence experience of the firefighters with the state as a whole. And what we found for male firefighters were these 4 cancers as being at increased risk. About a 56% increase for melanoma, 36% for prostate, 66% for testicular, and more than a 2-fold increased risk of thyroid cancer. And we also published data on female firefighters as well, but for today the focus is on men, because we're looking over long periods of time, and we just didn't have sufficient numbers of female firefighters to conduct our analyses. So what I'm showing you here are the cancers that were elevated in firefighters, and they were what we call statistically significant elevations in risk, indicating that we have high confidence that these 4 cancers are in fact statistically elevated in firefighters relative to the general Florida population. Now, we also found a number of cancers in firefighters that the rates, the proportions of firefighters who had tobacco-related cancers tended to be lower in firefighters than the general Florida population. And that's what I'm showing you right here. These are some of the tobacco-associated cancers that we went over in the previous slide. And the cancer sites that are marked by the star here are all statistically lower in firefighters than in the general Florida population. So this was a bit of a mystery as to why this would be. And we had done another linkage 15 years prior, which I'm not showing you today, but we saw that in our prior linkage as well, that firefighters tended to have a lower risk of these tobacco-related cancers. And of course, if you look at like lung cancer here, this is one that we would sort of intuitively think that, well, firefighters would be at increased risk of developing lung cancer relative to the Florida population, not decreased risk. Some of the firefighters in our cohort that were, working, decades ago, didn't always have the benefit of SCBA, and the course was gradually implemented. But we already know that even under optimal circumstances, under air, you can still have leaks around the mask. If you're working in a around a fire scene, not on air, you're getting some exposures that have been well documented now. So we know that that even though respiratory exposures to carcinogens has gone down dramatically, especially with the implementation of SCBA, still firefighters getting exposure. So why would they have in this case, about a 20% reduced rate of lung cancer relative to the general population? And of course, the question to ask would be, well, what is the smoking experience of firefighters over time? And so as a first question, we wanted to document what is the current smoking rates in Florida firefighters. And some of our FCI studies are actually looking at this. We have these questions about tobacco use and history of tobacco use that we ask in some of our surveys. But our FCI surveys are what we refer to as non-population based. Ideally, what you want to do is have a random sample of a population, and then you can infer from a random sample what the risk factor experience is for everyone in that population, if you have some sort of a random sampling strategy. So we look to, yes, I should probably introduce this first. So one of the big factors that happened in Florida Fire Service occurred in 1989, when legislation was passed requiring that new hires have to certify that they are non-tobacco users, and that's the reference period is the 12 months prior to hire. So since 1989, if you were a newly minted firefighter, before you were certified, you had to sign this affidavit certifying that you were a non-tobacco user. And this legislation was part of a really broad effort across the state, supported by firefighters, by the unions, the fire chiefs, and part of this was an effort to support firefighter presumptive legislation that they were trying to pass back in the 1980s in Florida. And back then, the focus was actually on presumptive legislation around heart disease, not cancer, because at the time there was a lot of heart disease, heart attacks, sudden deaths, cardiac deaths that were happening. They wanted presumptive legislation passed so that if a firefighter went down with the cardiovascular event like that, that it would be presumed to be a job-related fatality, and there would be benefits provided in that case. So part of the reluctance on the part of the legislature to pass any sort of presumptive legislation was, well, they would always point to the individual behavior of the firefighters and say, well, if you're a firefighter and you smoke, well, that's what caused your heart attack, not, your, carbon monoxide levels going up when you're fighting a fire, or, inflammatory response, to all those chemicals that you are exposed to on fire scenes that, accelerate atherosclerosis. It's, we're going to point the finger at your individual behaviors. And so it was thought that, if this legislation was passed, it would provide a stronger case for eventually getting presumptive legislation passed. Now, to the best of my knowledge, that actually never happened. And over time, with the emerging understanding of cancer risk in firefighters, that effort, of course, shifted, and we fortunately now have presumptive legislation that has been passed for a number of cancer subtypes in the state of Florida. But rewinding all the way back to 1989, this was really a major policy initiative, and the hope was that, to the extent that people were being honest in their certification, that those young firefighters would enter the fire service smoke-free and would continue not to and to remain smoke-free for the rest of their careers, and kind of move the profession to becoming more of a smoke-free profession. That was that was kind of the utopian hope that would actually happen. So as a first step, and we looked at this legislation and really felt, well, is it possible that this sort of somewhat unique legislation, because this is I don't know if there are other states that have done this, but Florida is definitely one of the few that has passed this, and has had this on the books since 1989. And could this policy initiative that was passed in 1989, could that have something to do with these lower smoking rate, tobacco related cancer risk in Florida firefighters? So this is our research question. And so as a first step, what we wanted to ask was, well, what is the current smoking rate among Florida firefighters? And as I said earlier, we could not, we cannot really extrapolate with any great degree of confidence using our FCI generated data, because that was a convenience sample of firefighters that were volunteering to fill out our surveys over time. So we turned our attention to what's called the Florida BRFSS, or Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System. This is a surveillance program initiated by the Centers for Disease Control. And this is done in every state on an annual basis. And it asks a series of basic questions about the health status and the risk factors for adult populations in each of those states. So there's a core set of questions. There are several questions related to smoking, and so we extracted information from the Florida BRFSS. Now, in some years in Florida, they would also ask about occupation. And they did that in 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017. And so we looked at those years, extracted all that information, and then we coded the occupational information into large categories, with, of course, firefighters being one of the categories that we were interested in. And so in this analysis, in this pooled analysis over this period of time, we gathered over 33,000 worker records, did this classification. Out of those 33,000, we had 131 firefighters, a reasonably robust sample, but still small. And then we grouped other major categories that we grouped workers into, included service workers, like restaurant workers, farmers, and blue collar workers. And when we did this, we were sort of thinking, well, the firefighter smoking prevalence rate might look most similar to blue collar workers, because in other national surveys that we've actually published, probably now about 20 years ago, using national data, the smoking rates for firefighters tended to mirror that of other blue collar workers. So that was 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but we didn't see that at all for Florida. So the rates were highest in blue collar, just over 25%. Also similar for farmers, and almost 20% in service workers. But for firefighters, we got this very small percentage who said that they were current smokers. I think this was 1.7% or something. Now, I am not entirely confident that this is a true reflection of the prevalence of smoking prevalence rate in Florida firefighters. The reason being that it's a relatively small sample size, and also there is the possibility of a social desirability bias that might be present here. We've seen this in other occupational groups, like doctors, nurses, clergy. These are individuals who have a sense that they know that they shouldn't smoke. So when a researcher asks them a question about their smoking, there's some evidence that they might be a little less accurate in their responses. And so this is a possibility here for the firefighters, because this is a very, very low percentage. But even if we're off, by a factor of 2, that would come in at 5%. And, that's a very, very low smoking rate, which is, if it's true, it's absolutely fabulous. So that was our first data point. So that raised the question, well, could we go back in time and get any sort of information on smoking rates in firefighters, to look at what was happening over time, especially before and after the implementation of this new law in 1989. So we turned back to our linked data that I just shared with you, linking cancer with Florida firefighters. And we were able to look at some time trends starting in the 1980s and then moving into 2011 to 2014. And so let me orient you to this. First of all, well, let me back up and tell you where we're getting this information from. So when a cancer is diagnosed in the state of Florida, and this is true for all of the other states as well, that information about the patient and the characteristics of the tumor are gathered up by what we call certified tumor registrars that work. It used to be exclusively all the diagnosing was happening in hospital settings. And so these registrars would be hired by the hospital to gather up that information and send it to the cancer registry, because cancer is what's referred to as a reportable event. So whoever diagnoses a cancer has a legal obligation to report that information to their state cancer registry. And it's the professional cancer registrars who are skilled at looking at a medical record and extracting the required information. One of the data fields that the cancer registrars extract was smoking status at the time of diagnosis. Are you a current smoker? Yes, no. Or was that information not in the cancer record anywhere? If it's not in the hospital record, then it's not reported to us. It's basically coded as, status unknown. So what we're looking at here is the proportion of cancer cases at the time of diagnosis that had an affirmation that they were smokers. But that doesn't mean that it's that's a smoking prevalence rate, because it also includes the percentage of cases that we didn't have any information on. And that percentage varied over time. So this is kind of a crude, sort of rough indicator of how smoking trends might have been changing over time. Okay. And so what we did was we excluded all of those tobacco associated cancers. We just set those aside. And we went with the non-tobacco associated cancers, which is the majority of cancers that are diagnosed, just to see what the trends were over time. Okay. So with that as a background, now let's take a look at what's happened for firefighters diagnosed with cancer, non-tobacco related cancers in the state of Florida over time, and contrast that with what the experience was for everyone in the state as a whole. And so what we see is that in the 1980s and extending into the early part of the 1990s, firefighters diagnosed with cancer had reported higher rates of smoking than in the general population. And that these things sort of crossed over here. It started looking very similar to the Florida experience, starting probably around year 2000, because these are just grouped rates here in 5-year intervals. And we basically applied some statistical analysis and basically showed that the rate of decline here was significantly faster for firefighters than it was for the state as a whole. Even though both of these lines were going down over time, they were initially very high in firefighters, and then started to drop much more dramatically than what we saw in Florida as a whole. So we took this as some evidence. Now remember, right here in 1989 is when that policy took effect, and between this first 5-year interval and the second, it was already going down. So smoking rates were dropping, and that was true for the state as a whole. But there was also evidence that this was true for firefighters as well. And so it's an open question as to whether or not this continued declines and the rapid, steeper descent here for the firefighters was driven perhaps in part by this policy that was put into place. So we at this point we stopped, and we took our data, we wrote it up, and we sent it to a couple of journals for consideration for publication. And we were turned down by the journals because they weren't really convinced that this was strong enough evidence to support our thesis that it may have something to do with that tobacco policy. So So we went back to the drawing board, and we have completed another analysis, which I'll share with you right now. And so remember, that analysis was based on non-tobacco related cancers, and we were just looking at the proportion of those at the time of diagnosis who said they were smokers. So then we asked the question, well, what about rates of tobacco associated cancers? How did they change over time for firefighters relative to the state as a whole? And so what we have down here are the, and again, we're limiting ourselves just to male firefighters because we just didn't have enough female firefighters over this long period of time to do any sort of meaningful analysis. But if we look at the state as a whole, this is the age-adjusted rate for all those tobacco-related cancers, lung cancer, the oral cancers, and so forth. And you can see that, it started out in the early 1980s, around 200 per 100,000, actually went up a bit and stayed pretty stable, and then this was a period of greater decline. And because we're just talking about hundreds of thousands of records, our statistical tools will enable us to, with great precision, tell us if this line is increasing, staying flat, or decreasing. And that's what these numbers refer to. So in the 1990s, the annual percent change was going down slightly, about 1% per year during that period. And that was what we call a join point. And then there was an acceleration from basically the year 2000 to 2007. This decline was about 2.5 percentage points per year. And then the reduction continues up until 2014, but back down to just a little more than 1% reduction per year. So that was the experience of the state as a whole. Again, just all males diagnosed with tobacco-related cancers. So this slope here was all the other cancers, and we just put that in for contrast. And we won't dwell on this, but there was a big increase here in the late 1980s. This is being driven largely by the emergence of the PSA test, which identified a lot of hidden prostate cancers. Once that sort of worked its way out of the system, these cancer rates were pretty flat for the state as a whole, and then started to decline. And this was a significant reduction here in the non-tobacco related cancers. All right, so up here, this is our male firefighter cancer trends. So these are the tobacco related cancers and then the non-tobacco related cancers. So we see a different, well, let me point this out first, which is the background rates, okay? So age-adjusted rate for all these tobacco-associated cancers in the early years for the state as a whole started out at about 200 per 100,000. And in those same years for firefighters, the rate was actually half of that. And you see a similar pattern for the non-tobacco related cancers here. In the early years, it was around 400 per 100,000. In the early years for firefighters, it was half that again. And now what accounts for this? This is an example of what we refer to as a healthy worker effect, because we know that on average, workers are healthier than just the entire population, because you have to have a certain level of health in order to be in the workforce. And healthy worker effect is sort of turbocharged for firefighters, because you all know the high standards to to be trained as a firefighter and to maintain high levels of readiness, so you're able to do your job. So we're always working against this healthy worker phenomenon. And when we make a comparison of, let's say, the cancer experience of firefighters to the state as a whole, we always have that kind of baked in, this healthy worker effect. So when you do see an increase in a particular cancer in firefighters relative to the state as a whole, that's like a red flag that, you know, there's something there. What we're missing probably are some cancers, and we could even talk about lung cancer as an example. Remember, I showed you it was about a 20% reduction relative to the state as a whole. But when we have that healthy worker effect sort of baked in, it's hard for us to really take that out, statistically speaking. So if the real, you know, lung cancer risk in firefighters could very well be elevated, but our tools that we use are somewhat limited. So anyway, so keep in mind the differences in the rates when we're comparing state as a whole versus just firefighters in general. So now let's talk a little bit about what was happening in the 1980s and early 1990s for firefighters. We're actually seeing an increase here over time, and then a bit of a peak here, and then a decline. And now we can state that there was a statistically significant decline starting right here at this peak and extending all the way down to 2040. And roughly what we're seeing here is that there's a 2% reduction annually in the age-adjusted incidence rate for tobacco-related cancers in firefighters. The pattern for the non-tobacco related cancers is also a bit different than what we're seeing here for the state as a whole. There was a steady increase of 5 percentage points per year over time that peaked here in 2001 and then started to decline, but we can't really state that this decline here for firefighters is statistically significant. So let's kind of dial back now and talk again about the passage of this particular law, which happened in 1989. We would not expect passage of that law to really have any sort of impact on the trajectory of cancer risk, tobacco-related cancer risk in firefighters, because for two reasons. One is the law was really focused on new hires. It was silent on incumbent firefighters. You know, if you were already in and you were a smoker, no problem. And to be perfectly honest, you could also have lied on your affidavit as a new smoker and then immediately just picked up the habit again once you were safely in a fire station. So we wouldn't expect anything anytime soon. And then recall again that latency effect that we saw between cigarette consumption and the rise and fall of lung cancer at a national level. So what we would expect if there was some sort of a policy effect, that we wouldn't see that it would be delayed as much as two decades. And so we did see this rise here that was statistically significant and sort of peaked here, and then it has started to go down as well. But this that difference here was well, the increase was not statistically significant, but there should be a negative sign here. This is a significant reduction here from 1995 to 2014. And that slope of about 2 percentage points a year, how does that compare to what they were seeing, for the state as a whole? There were reductions as well, but remember, there was also an absolute difference in the rates, starting out almost twice as high in the state as a whole versus what we experienced for firefighters. So, what do we make of all this? Well, first of all, it's important to state that it really is not possible to make strong inferences here about any sort of policy impacts on firefighter smoking rates in Florida and cancer risk. We already talked about the long latency between exposure and outcomes. We also were very limited. We don't have any of this population-based information on smoking over decades in firefighters. We don't have information on how much people were smoking. We use a measure of exposure called pack years to capture not only whether or not you're smoking, but how much you're smoking, because we know that that's related to risk of developing cancer. More you smoke, greater the risk. The other factor here is that we sort of lumped all the tobacco-related cancers together in our analysis, and one of the reasons we did that is that we needed some statistical power in order to do that. But it's important to note that not all cancers, even though we mentioned the 18 that were related, some have much higher what we refer to as attributable risk than others that are still related, but the smoking component is not as large. So for lung cancer, the attributable risk is typically 85 to 90%. So 85–90% of the lung cancer can be attributed to smoking, leaving very little. You do get lung cancer in non-smokers and those that are also not exposed to secondhand smoke. So it's not a perfect causal association, but that's pretty strong when you get up to that level. But some of the other tobacco-related cancers, much smaller attributable risks of say 20%. So we threw them all together, and that's somewhat of a problem as well. The other thing that's happening over time is that the firefighter workforce is becoming more diverse, and different race and ethnic groups coming into the workforce, they have different smoking patterns and histories. So that can sort of muddy the waters as we're trying to understand these broad trends that are occurring over long periods of time. And then, of course, there were other policies that were happening. So back in 1989, there was probably everyone who was a smoker was permitted to smoke in the firehouse. But as we learned about the hazards of secondhand smoke, and we started to implement indoor smoking bans, that hit the firehouses too at different stages. I'm sure it happened, differently across the state. The adaptation of that as well. So there's other things that were happening, lots of moving targets here that also make it difficult for us to point to that one policy change in 1989 as perhaps helping to drive down the rates of tobacco-related cancers in Florida firefighters. So what we don't have, and I wish we did, was another study, just like the one we did here in Florida, in an adjacent state like Georgia, who I would have to look this up, but presumably they did not pass a law like this in the state of Georgia. And then we could compare the tobacco-related cancer trends in Florida firefighters to what was being experienced in Georgia. And that would be a more powerful test. But This type of analysis that we've done in Florida is really not being repeated in other states. So we would probably have to go and do it ourselves, or partner with people in the state of Georgia, or even ideally just like a regional linkage, and then we could more formally test what happens to these tobacco-related cancer trends over time in states that did versus did not implement these kinds of policies. So we're nowhere near being able to do that. So the next steps for us are that we're going to go back to the BRFSS and see if there are any additional years of data that we can add to our pooled data, because I'm still a little suspicious of that very, very low rate of smoking in firefighters. I want to be convinced that that's a real prevalence and a very low prevalence. And if it is, that's a huge success story for this workforce here in Florida. And so once we do that, we're going to make another pass at trying to get this published. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. That was a great presentation. Really, some interesting facts that I know people have questions about. So I will leave it open for any questions.
And I'm not seeing a chat or anything, so you'll have to relay.
Yeah, I'll read the
Okay.
if anything comes through. So far, nothing has come through yet. Yep, here comes one. Could you please comment on e-cigarettes and low rates of smoking?
Yeah, great question. So there has been some work, not so much on e-cigarettes, but other tobacco substitutes. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the policies that are in place now at most fire stations across the country, where you just can't light up at the dining room table, right? That's not allowed anymore. But if you're a smoker, let's say a cigarette smoker, and you're pulling a 24-hour shift, your options are limited. You can go outside and smoke if that's permitted. Some probably have policies where you're not even allowed to smoke on the grounds, or you can wear a nicotine patch, or you can chew into an oral form of tobacco, or you can you might be able to use an e-cigarette, which is a little more. I mean, it's still typically not allowed to be used indoors, but it doesn't produce the kind of clouds of blue smoke that you get from a cigarette. So there might be some of that going on, at the fire stations. And there is a raging debate in the tobacco control community about the value of e-cigarettes. And there is a component of folks in the tobacco control community, we'll call them the harm reduction crowd. And they point to the fact that the available data on e-cigarettes suggests that e-cigarette use is far less toxic, especially carcinogenically, than continuing to smoke with, just continuing to smoke cigarettes. So there is a camp that really pushes endorses, let's say, the use of e-cigarettes for individuals who have tried to quit smoking and have been unsuccessful. So let's substitute. You'll get your nicotine through the e-cigarettes, but your carcinogenic load will go down dramatically. It's not zero. There's definitely risks associated with e-cigarettes, but orders of magnitude smaller in all likelihood to be smoking, to substitute, cigarettes for e-cigarettes. So I don't know if that was the intent of your question or not. and you can always ask a follow-up.
Yeah, and so then there was follow-up questions about any delineation between the types of tobacco use. So I think you touched a little bit on this just now, but specifically people want to know about cigars and smokeless, so chewing and dipping.
Yeah. So you can roughly, a kind of a crude continuum here is smoked is the worst. Oral forms, lower risk, and then probably even further lower risk would be the use of e-cigarettes. So I mentioned at the beginning that there are a couple of cancers that are related to oral forms of tobacco use. Cigars versus cigarettes. Again, you see pretty high attributable risk for cigars versus cigarettes. But there is a dose issue here. If you're smoking 2 packs a day versus having 1 or 2 cigars a day, your carcinogenic load tends to be lower if you're smoking cigars. But it's still, the risk is about 4-fold, I believe. And I'm speaking off the top of my head, so I may be off on that. But, the risk of developing lung cancer in cigarettes is more like 10 to 12-fold greater in cigarette smokers versus non-smokers. Cigar smokers, it's something around 4-fold increase relative to, never smokers. So, again, there's the combustion of the cigarette tobacco is just, going back to that slide, it's a witch's brew, right, of exposures, and so it's best to prioritize not doing that. But you have to acknowledge that for most people who are using tobacco products, they started in their teens, and that's when they became addicted to the nicotine, and that's really a powerful it's a powerful phenomenon. It's very difficult to break. Was it W.C. Fields who said it's easy to quit smoking? I've done it 100 times or 1,000 times. I think it was something to that effect. I might be misattributing that to a wrong comedian, but it's really tough. It's really tough if you are a smoker.
Right.
Other questions?
That's all we have listed, unless anyone has any other questions. I know we're a little over time, so we thank everyone for being here today. And thank you again, Dr. Lee. Really great topic. I know it's always a topic of conversation when we go to different conferences with firefighters. They want to know these answers, so really appreciate it. For everyone else on the call, just a reminder, we will be back 1 month from now for the next seminar series in October, where I will be presenting on our cancer prevention, education, and survivorship program. So looking forward to updating you on our program there. Also wanted to let you know that the save the date is out for our 2024 International Firefighter Cancer Symposium, which will be the last week in February again. So with the 23rd and 24th, which is a Thursday and Friday. And we hope to get the registration link out to you guys by the end of this week. So we are looking forward to it. It will be back at the Shalala Center on University of Miami Coral Gables campus. And so we are looking forward to another great 2 days of symposium, and followed by the Saturday Dolphins Challenge Cancer, where we'll have our Firefighters vs. Cancer team. So thank you all for being here. More info to come on all of these different events. And as always, thank you for your support. Have a good one.
Hi, Rod.